Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a seriously fascinating textual analysis today, focusing on a pretty significant piece of media, the July 2026 JW Broadcasting Talk. Now, at its core, this presentation makes a strong case for unquestioning obedience to leadership. And honestly, whether you're deep into theology or just really intrigued by the mechanics of how modern authority justifies itself, you're going to find this interesting. We're going to impartially break down the nuts and bolts of the arguments presented in this talk. But before we get into the weeds, I want you to consider a pretty profound question raised by the source material. Is human imperfection a shield for absolute authority? Think about it. When we look at high control groups or religious leadership, how exactly do leaders balance the demand for total subjection with the unavoidable everyday reality of human error? Keep that in the back of your mind because it is absolutely central to today's breakdown. Okay, let's dive right in. Here is our roadmap for the day. Based on the source text's critical breakdown, we'll be analyzing 4 key argumentative flaws. 1. The Joshua equivalency flaw. 2. Misinterpreting Paul's compromise. 3. The omitted biblical duty. And finally, number 4, the imperfect men paradox.
Starting off with Section 1, the Joshua equivalency flaw.
So the broadcast essentially builds the argument that modern followers need to demonstrate the exact same unquestioning obedience to leadership that the ancient Israelites showed to Joshua. But the analysis points out a crucial missing piece to this puzzle: divine confirmation. Biblically speaking, this means having explicit, public, and literally undeniable supernatural miracles that actually verify a person's authority. You see, God didn't just casually ask the Israelites to blindly trust Joshua. He publicly vindicated him with these massive, undeniable miracles. First, you have the parting of the Jordan River, which, by the way, Scripture notes was done specifically so the people would know Joshua had divine backing. Then there's bringing down the massive walls of Jericho. And later, he literally commands the sun to stand still. I mean, this wasn't subtle. It was overwhelming physical proof. Now, what's really interesting about this analysis is the stark contrast it highlights. On one hand, you have Joshua, a miraculously confirmed prophet. On the other hand, you have modern leadership. And the critique points directly to the organization's own literature for this, specifically the February 2017 Watchtower, where the governing body explicitly states that they are, quote, neither inspired nor infallible, and that they can err in doctrinal matters. So the source material identifies this as a massive false equivalency. It points out the logical contradiction here. You're taking the exact same unquestioning obedience meant for a miraculously confirmed prophet and demanding it for a group of self-admitted, fallible men. The argument is that without that miraculous proof, the biblical standard actually shifts. It moves from unquestioning obedience to, well, actively testing the fruit of those leaders. All right, let's move to Section 2, misinterpreting Paul's compromise. We'll impartially lay out the broadcast's next claim here, which centers heavily on the book of Acts, chapter 21. The presenter brings up a moment where the Apostle Paul complied with the Jerusalem elders to undergo a ceremonial cleansing ritual. The broadcast uses this to argue that, hey, since Paul obeyed a directive he probably didn't personally agree with, just to maintain unity, modern witnesses have to similarly obey centralized policies, even if they don't fully understand or agree with them. But the textual analysis flags a pretty huge contextual gap with this line of reasoning. In reality, in Acts 21, Paul's compliance was a highly tactical, localized cultural concession. He was just trying to avoid needlessly stumbling Jewish believers. It didn't change any core doctrines, and it certainly didn't violate his Christian conscience. Compare that to how it's being applied today, to demand strict, absolute compliance with binding, life-altering mandates, like the blood policy or judicial arrangements. Making the scriptural leap from a localized cultural compromise to absolute obedience on binding disciplinary matters just doesn't hold up, according to the critique. And here is a wild, almost ironic piece of historical context highlighted by the source. That advice from the elders in Acts 21, it actually backfired completely. Literally, complying with that specific directive led directly to a mob attacking Paul, his immediate arrest, and the absolute end of his public ministry in Jerusalem. So using an instance of historically failed advice that ended in total disaster as your biblical foundation for absolute obedience today, well, the text argues it's highly problematic. Which brings us to Section 3, the omitted biblical duty. Let's move to and see how this builds, because the critique notes that this entire analysis is just as much about what the July 2026 broadcast left out. Look at the actual scriptural precedents. In Acts 17, the Bible literally praises the Beroeans as noble-minded. Why?
specifically because they cross-examined the Apostle Paul's teachings daily against the Scriptures. They didn't just blindly nod and obey. On top of that, 1 John 4:1 explicitly commands Christians to test the inspired expressions. The biblical record actively commends those who double-check the facts.
And because of this omission, the source argues the broadcast creates what it calls a closed loop. By demanding unquestioning obedience, the framework essentially shuts down critical thinking. Just think about the implications of that. It actively penalizes the exact same behavior, that Berean-style scriptural scrutiny, that the Bible commends. Logically, you simply can't be a noble-minded Berean if the very rules of your organization require you to obey without question. Let's transition to our final section, number 4. The imperfect men paradox. This is perhaps the most crucial part of the entire textual analysis, how the broadcast handles the inevitable, unavoidable reality that leaders make mistakes. The presenter actually anticipates this objection about past errors and sets up a preemptive defense stating, quote, "God has always used imperfect men. Therefore, human imperfection does not invalidate their authority." The core idea they are pushing is that followers must view these directives as coming directly from God, regardless of how flawed the men delivering them might be. And this brilliantly illustrates the final counter-argument from the source. Yes, absolutely, God used imperfect men in the Bible. But, and this is a big but, when those men spoke prophetically, their messages were flawless. Under the standards set in Deuteronomy 18, if a prophet gave a wrong command or a false prediction, they weren't just given a pass for being imperfect. No, they were completely rejected as a false prophet. Yet in the modern context, imperfection is routinely used as a convenient shield to excuse altered policies or failed predictions.
The analysis points out that this dynamic creates a deeply troubling double standard. Think about it. When leadership makes a mistake, they are excused, often framing the correction positively as new light. But that same tolerance? It is completely denied to the followers. If an everyday follower notices those exact same doctrinal errors and points them out before the organization officially changes them, they don't get a pass. They face severe discipline and often shunning. The grace that leadership claims for themselves is weaponized against the rank and file. So bringing all of this together, the source critique lands on this very clear objective conclusion. Imperfection simply cannot be used as an escape hatch to avoid accountability while simultaneously demanding total, unquestioning subjection from your followers. When you stack up the logical inconsistencies, from that initial false equivalency of Joshua to taking Paul's cultural compromise totally out of context, right down to the glaring double standard on errors, it reveals a framework that seems much more focused on maintaining centralized authority than upholding biblical consistency.
So, what does this all mean for us? I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on. If human imperfection is the ultimate shield used to protect leadership from accountability, can that exact same imperfection logically justify demanding absolute subjection from the individual believer? It is a massive paradox, and one that really challenges the very boundaries of organizational authority versus Christian conscience. Thank you so much for joining me for today's explainer. Keep asking those tough questions and keep learning. Catch you next time.